You know what used to drive me crazy every single summer? You do everything right in the spring. You work compost into the beds. You set your transplants out on time. You water, you mulch. You even feed them once or twice just to be safe. And for a while, everything looks good. The tomatoes are green, the peppers are upright, the beans are climbing. Then July shows up with that hard heat, and suddenly your whole garden starts acting hungry. The leaves lose that deep, healthy color. Growth slows down for no obvious reason. Fruit stays smaller than it should. Your squash wilts by mid-afternoon. Your tomatoes start curling at the top. So what do? Same thing I did for years. You water more. You add fertilizer. You baby the plants even harder. And maybe they perk up for a few days, but they never really take off the way you hoped. By August, it feels like your garden is surviving instead of producing. That is what I believed gardening was for a very long time. But then a few summers ago, I was in Lancaster County looking over an Amish garden in the middle of a dry stretch. And what stopped me cold was not what I saw above the soil. It was what that growth told me had to be happening below it. The plants were dark green, steady, loaded, and unfazed by the heat. No frantic watering, no weak top growth, no look of strain. Just calm. Even production like the season had barely touched them. And I remember standing there thinking, these plants are not being carried by the surface. They are being fed from somewhere deeper. That was the moment I started asking a different question. Not how do I feed the plant this week, but how do I grow roots so deep and so strong that the garden can keep feeding itself all season long? I'll be honest with you. For a long time, I thought I knew what it meant to feed a garden. I thought the answer was fertilizer. If the plants drooped, the answer was water. I was always trying to fix what I could see above the soil. And for years, I mistook that constant reaction for real gardening. It was just what you did. You watched the tops like a hawk. You worried about blossom drop, yellowing, curling, slow fruit set, and midday wilting. You fed the bed from the surface. You hoped the plants would respond fast enough to keep the season moving. If they bounced back, you told yourself the problem was solved. Then the next hot spell came, or the next dry week, and it all started over again. I did that cycle for more years than I want to admit. I watered too often and too shallow because I was afraid deep watering was not reaching fast enough. I fed too close to the surface. I loosened and disturbed the upper layer of soil thinking I was helping roots breathe when I was training plants to stay near the easy stuff. I wanted quick proof, quick greening, quick growth. I did not understand that every shortcut I loved was teaching the plant the wrong lesson. I was teaching it that everything it needed would always be waiting near the top. And that sounds harmless until summer gets serious. Because when all the food and all the moisture are concentrated near the surface, that is exactly where the stress hits first. That top layer dries out first. It heats up first. It is the least stable part of the whole growing environment. I had built a garden that depended on the most fragile zone in the bed. Then I wondered why the plants looked strong in May and needy in July. Looking back now, I can see that a lot of us were taught to garden for speed, not resilience. We were taught to chase visible growth. We were taught that if the plant looked lush, then everything underneath must be fine. We were taught to think of roots almost as a formality. But roots are not just plumbing. Roots are the story. Roots are where the plant decides whether it can keep going. Roots are where stability comes from. Roots are where the long season is won or lost. I did not understand that then. What I understood was effort. I knew how to work hard. I knew how to carry watering cans, mix fertilizers, and study signs of stress. I knew how to look busy in a garden, and I know a lot of people watching this are probably in the same place I was. Most of us are not lazy gardeners. We are overcommitted gardeners. We rush in and rescue plants over and over. I thought being a good gardener meant never letting a plant struggle for a single day. Now I see a plant as asking for a reason to dig deeper. Even when a season ended fairly well, I was still exhausted by it. The garden felt like one long emergency. I never felt ahead. I was always correcting, rescuing, adjusting, supplementing, compensating. Some crops limped through and some years were decent enough. But deep down, I knew something was off. Because if a method only works when the weather is mild, that is not a strong system. That is a fragile one. Then the heat would settle in for a week, and suddenly the whole garden seemed to shrink back into itself. Leaves got tired, fruit stalled. Plants that should have been surging into production acted like they were living hand to mouth. I kept trying to pour life in from above. That is the confession. I was not really feeding my garden. I was managing symptoms. I was not building depth. I was rewarding dependency. I was not growing strong roots. I was growing spoiled plants. My old habits became hard to defend. I had confused surface response with true strength. I had confused fast improvement with lasting health. I had confused a green top with a well-built plant. But when I started paying attention to how Amish growers approach the same summer stress, I realized I had been solving one problem and creating another. The shift happened for me on a humid afternoon in Lancaster County. I had been walking along the edge of an Amish property. At first, nothing seemed flashy. There were no giant gadgets, no bottles lined up on shelves, no miracle product with a shiny label. Just neat rows, heavy mulch, and plants that looked settled. That is the word that kept coming to mind. Settled. They did not look like plants begging to be rescued. They looked like they knew exactly where to find what they needed. This was the kind of weather that usually exposed every weakness in a garden. The top inch of soil would have been hot and dry. But these beds looked steady. Not dramatic, not overfed, just strong. No look of strain in the leaf color. I remember stopping in front of a row of tomatoes and crouching down. The stem was thick, the lower leaves were clean. The mulch around it had that soft, settled look. And when I pulled back just a little of that top layer, the soil underneath was cool. Not damp and soggy, not crusted and dry, just cool, dark, and alive. That got my attention immediately. The plant was not living off emergency inputs from the surface. It was sitting over a root zone that had been protected and kept stable. I asked the man I was with how often they watered those beds during a stretch like this. He looked at me for a second. He said something simple. If the roots stay near the top, the sun owns them. If the roots go down, the plant can fend for itself. That was it. No long speech, no lecture, just one line. And that line explained more to me than a stack of gardening books ever had. All at once, I could see the whole pattern. They were not trying to win the season from above. They were building it from below. Everything in that garden was encouraging downward growth. The way the beds were prepared, the way organic matter was worked in over time, the way mulch protected the top layer, the way plants were not being trained to expect little sips and little snacks when weather turned difficult. They were not feeding panic, they were feeding reach, and once I saw that, I started noticing it everywhere. The corn stood firm without that thin, thirsty look I was used to seeing by mid-season. The beans had a steadiness to them that told me they were pulling from more than yesterday's watering. Even the squash had a kind of grounded strength to it. The leaves were broad and full, but the plants did not look soft. They looked anchored. That is the part I had missed for years. I thought vigorous top growth meant a strong plant. Real strength is often hidden. A plant that can reach down is a plant that can ride out more heat and more of the ordinary stress that wears down the average garden. And the Amish did not arrive at that by accident. This was not some trendy method. It came from generations of growing food. When you're feeding a family from the same ground year after year, you start paying attention to what builds endurance. I realized I had been treating roots like a side effect of gardening. The Amish were treating roots like the main event. That was the discovery. The goal was never just to throw nutrients at the leaves. The goal was to create a root zone so attractive, so protected, and so well supplied below the surface that the plant would keep driving downward until summer stress stopped being a crisis. And once that clicked for me, the whole garden changed shape in my mind. I began to see the real work of a productive garden. Creating conditions that invite roots to go where the season cannot easily hurt them. So, here is what this video is really about. It is not about forcing your plants to grow faster with some miracle feed. It is not about chasing greener leaves. And it is definitely not about turning your garden into another summer job where you have to rescue every bed every 3 days. This is about understanding the Amish way of building a garden from the bottom up, so your plants start finding lasting food and moisture. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly how they create that kind of root depth and how you can start doing the same thing without needing fancy equipment or a complete garden overhaul. Because once you understand the principle, things start making sense. You begin to see why shallow watering creates weak plants. You begin to see why bare soil works against you. You begin to see why a garden can look lush early on and still fail to carry its strength into late summer. And most importantly, you understand how to build a root zone that keeps feeding your plants long after the top layer has dried out. I am going to break this down in a simple order. First, I will show you how the Amish prepare the soil in a way that gives roots a reason to travel downward, instead of hanging around near the surface where all the stress lives. That one shift alone changes how your whole garden behaves once the weather gets tough. Then we are going to talk about moisture, because this is where a lot of gardeners accidentally train their plants to stay shallow. I will show you how to build deep water access. After that, we will get into the cover layer on top, because what happens above the soil affects everything happening below it. This is one of the quietest parts of the system. Then I want to show you how they feed the soil itself instead of spoon-feeding the plant week by week. That completely changes the relationship between your crops and the ground. And after that, we are going to look at one of the biggest mistakes most of us make, which is encouraging fast surface growth when we should be encouraging root expansion. By the end of this, you will know how to set up your garden, so the roots do more of the work and you do less of the rescuing. You will understand why some plants hold on through heat. And stick around to the end, because I am going to share one simple Amish trick for getting young plants to drive their roots down faster after transplanting. The first step is to build what I now think of as an invitation zone. If you want roots to go deep, you have to make the lower soil more welcoming than the surface. Most of us do the opposite. We fluff the top few inches, sprinkle compost where we can see it, water lightly and often, and then wonder why the roots stay right there. But roots are not sentimental. They go where life is easiest. If all the oxygen, moisture, and food are near the top, that is where they will stay. And that is exactly why so many gardens look strong early and tired late. What I noticed in those Amish beds was that the top did not feel like a feeding station. The whole root zone felt usable. The plants were not living in a shallow tray of good soil. They were living over a deeper reserve. That is the first shift you need to make. Here is what that means in practice. Before you plant anything, stop thinking only about the top 3 inches. Think about the first foot. That is the zone that decides whether your crops can keep pulling water and nutrition when summer turns rough. If that deeper layer is tight or lifeless, your plants are going to stall. The Amish approach is not to pamper the surface, it is to open the pathway downward. I learned this the hard way in one of my own beds. I had a row that always looked good in spring and always disappointed by midsummer. Every year I blamed the weather. One fall I finally dug down instead of looking across. About 4 inches below the surface, the soil changed from loose and dark to tight and stubborn. Roots had been spreading sideways because going down was harder than staying put. Once I saw that, I could not unsee it. So this is what I do now. Take a digging fork or a broad fork and work the bed before planting. Not to pulverize it, just to open it. Push the fork down as deeply as you can, rock it back gently, and move on. You are not flipping the bed upside down. You are creating channels. You are breaking that invisible barrier that tells roots to stop. Go across the whole bed like that. If your soil is already loose, this will be easy. After that, lay down 2 to 3 inches of finished compost across the bed and work it into the upper part of the soil, roughly the top 4 to 6 inches. That matters. Notice I did not say leave it sitting only on top. You want the entire upper zone to be biologically active, crumbly, and worth moving through. Compost helps hold moisture, feeds microbes, and creates the kind of structure roots can actually travel through instead of fighting. The Amish growers were not feeding one plant at a time with panic. They were conditioning the whole bed so every plant had somewhere to go. Now, let me add something important here. This is where a lot of gardeners accidentally sabotage themselves. They create a rich little pocket and a hard world around it. It is like giving the plant a recliner and snacks and then asking it to go train for a marathon. It has no reason to. It will circle in comfort. What you want instead is a bed that says, keep going. There is something for you down here too. Deep roots start with deep access. A plant cannot explore what the soil will not permit. If the lower zone is dense, crusted, or lifeless, the problem is not that the plant is lazy. The problem is that the path is closed. You are not feeding the plant for today. You are building a deeper pantry for the whole season. That is what step 1 is really about. If you get this first step right, you have already started shifting the burden off the surface and into the root zone where it belongs. And the next step is making sure your watering does not undo all of that good work by training the roots to stay shallow anyway. Now, step 2 is where a lot of gardeners accidentally undo all the good work from step 1. They water too often and too lightly. The surface stays damp, and the roots learn the worst possible lesson. Stay shallow, stay comfortable, wait for the next easy drink. The Amish approach is almost the opposite. Water less often, but water long enough that moisture moves down into the bed. You are not refreshing the top inch. You are charging the deeper zone. And when the water goes down, the roots go after it. Step 3 is to protect that root zone from above. This is where mulch stops being a finishing touch and becomes part of the feeding system. Most people think mulch is mainly for weed control, but its real value is stability. It keeps the topsoil from baking and slows evaporation. It softens the wild swings between hot and dry and wet and crusted. Roots do not like chaos. They like steady conditions. Step 4 is to feed the soil instead of spoon-feeding the plant. If all your fertility comes in little doses from the top, the plant stays dependent. But if the bed is enriched with compost and organic matter, the soil becomes a pantry instead of a plate. The microbes go to work. Nutrients are released over time, and the plant starts living from a deeper reserve. You are building a system that supplies it when conditions get rough, and step 5 may be the hardest. Do not reward soft top growth too early. When a plant is young, it is tempting to keep pushing lush leaves. Too much easy feeding can create a plant that looks impressive before it is resilient. Let the plant do some honest work. Let it search. Let it anchor. Steps 2 through 5 are taking your garden off the surface economy and moving it into a deeper system. That is the real shift. Most garden failures follow a pattern. Once you see the pattern, you stop blaming yourself and start changing the system. The conventional pattern is shallow watering, a little every day, just enough to make the soil look wet and the plant look relieved. Most of us are trained to manage the plant from above. The Amish are building conditions below. That is why one garden panics and the other keeps producing. Now here is the bonus technique I promised you at the beginning, and it is one of the smartest ways I know to get a young transplant to send its roots down fast instead of letting them hover near the surface. You see, a transplant is at its most vulnerable the day it leaves the pot. It's used to being babied. If you just drop it in a hole and water the top, those roots are going to stay right where the water is, shallow. And that's a setup for failure when the real heat hits in a few weeks. So, here's the trick. Take a 1-gallon milk jug or juice bottle, one of those plastic ones you usually just throw in the recycle bin. Take a nail or a small drill and poke 4 to 5 small holes in the bottom, not big holes. Think about the width of a pencil tip. You want the water to seep, not gush. Then, when you set out your transplant, bury that jug right next to the plant. You want to dig a hole deep enough that the top 2 inches are still sticking above the soil line. Make sure you leave the cap off so the air can flow. You're building a direct pipeline to the root zone. When it is time to water, do not soak the whole surface. That just invites weeds and trains the plant to stay high. Instead, fill that jug to the very top and walk away. Over the next 30 to 45 minutes, the water will seep slowly out of those little holes and move directly into the lower root zone at a speed the soil can actually absorb. No runoff, no wasted splash on the top layer that just evaporates in the sun. It's a deep watering dose that hits exactly where the plant needs it most. 1 full jug is about 1 gallon, which is a strong deep watering dose for a single tomato, pepper, or squash transplant. It's the perfect amount to get them through a few days. What I love about this trick is that it changes the plant's behavior from the very first day. Instead of building a lazy little mat of roots in the first few inches, the transplant starts following water downward almost immediately. That means better anchoring, steadier growth, and less stress once the real summer heat arrives. You're training the plant to be self-sufficient from the start. Looking back over everything we've talked about today, from preparing that first foot of soil to the deep watering and heavy mulching, it all points back to that one Amish line. If the roots stay near the top, the sun owns them. If the roots go down, the plant can fend for itself. That's the difference between a garden that's an emergency and a garden that's a system. When you build from the bottom up, you're not just growing food for this week, you're building endurance for the whole season. You're creating a soil pantry that supplies nutrients and moisture, even when you can't be there to rescue every bed. And when you see those rows standing firm in the July heat, while the neighbors are out there with their hoses every afternoon, you'll know you finally got it right. If you enjoyed watching this video and found this old school wisdom helpful, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the channel reach more gardeners like you. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Which part of this method are you going to try first? Is it the broad forking, the deep mulch, or maybe this buried jug trick? I read every single one. And if you want more of this practical gardening advice that actually works in a modern backyard, go ahead and subscribe. We've got a lot more to cover this season. Because at the end of the day, a strong garden is not built by rescuing plants over and over from the surface. It is built by giving them a reason to reach deeper. And once the roots learn where the real life is, the whole garden starts to change. That is where lasting harvests begin.